Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our Yetena work and EMA CME. We're going to have a session now, starting from now. So as you know, Yetena work, CME, we've nearly had 30 CME so far. So we'll be starting our session in a few minutes, focusing on geriatric medicine, our last session. So as you know, Yetena work's CME was in association with EMA and the SCP and EDVS. We've been providing this CME, giving accreditation to the attendees. You can get the sessions on in our YouTube channel after we broadcast this session. So to give you highlights on to get the best experience on the CME, you need to attend the whole session, and because the minutes will be checked virtually, and fill in the Google form. We'll be sharing it at the end of the session, and get 50% and above on post-webinar quiz. And we would like to say to wait patiently until we share the certificate. So as you know, we've had 3 sessions prior. On July 23, we had introduction to aging and geriatric medicine in low and middle income countries. And on August 6, we had non-communicable disease in low and middle income countries and the triple burden. And on September 3, we had dementia, the grave epidemic of Alzheimer's disease. So today, Professor Mark will be sharing us on what we don't know and the central research questions in age and aging. Professor Mark, I would like to say really thank you for dedicating your time. Here with us, we've got Dr. Alkidan, we've got Dr. Tadail, and me, Dr. Zaganesh, the CME, Yetena CME lead. So ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor to introduce our esteemed guest speaker, Professor Mark, who is from Israel. In the face of ongoing conflict, Professor Mark has shown unwavering dedication to be with us today, and our thoughts and prayers go out to him and his family, and we hope for peace and safety to all affected, and peace. And so please join us in welcoming Professor Mark. You can start your session.
Thank you Thank you very much. Always nice to see you. And although we are in the middle of a conflict right now, it does help me to come out of my funk and talk to friends around the world. So you're actually doing me a big favor by asking me to do this tonight. Let's see if I can screen share. That looks like the right thing. How's that? You can see that all right? Yeah?
Yes, we can see it.
Yeah, okay, and you can hear me all right. So we've had 3 sessions already on aging, different aspects. It's a big field, but we've touched on 3 aspects. And today, I thought I'd talk to you a little bit about some of the research questions that are still open. So if any of you feel like winning the Nobel Prize in the next 30 years, these are the questions that if you answer them, you're very likely to be very famous and rich, and maybe even win the Nobel Prize. So I like to start my general talks with this slide, that before we get to aging, which is of course very, very important, there's other things. There's war and peace, and we're in the middle of a war right now, which distracts us from looking after people. There's always the problem of global warming, which we need to never forget. There's a new challenge of artificial intelligence. What does it mean to us? How are we going to cope with it? And then my favorite subject, aging, which deals with everything, including the 3 topics above. So some of you might or might not know the difference between geriatrics and gerontology. A geriatrician, me, is like a pediatrician for old people. I'm a doctor, a pediatrician for children, geriatrician for old people. So that's the best analogy. Gerontology is the study of aging in its broadest sense. You'd hope that all geriatricians are gerontologists, but not all gerontologists are geriatricians. Many people study various aspects of aging, the social aspects, the cultural aspects, financial aspects, anthropological aspects. There's a lot of art and aging, poetry and aging. There are a lot of things to look at in persecution of aging, in other words, ageism, like racism. But I'm going to concentrate primarily on what we don't know in geriatrics. So first of all, you've seen this slide now many times. And it just, for those of you that haven't, this just shows you the percentage of people under age 5. The day I was born in 1950, it was 12%, and the percentage of people in the world over 65 is only 5%. Look at the change. So you're going through a tremendous revolution. And although we can show you this graph, we don't always understand why it's happened, what it means. So anybody who can deal in a research question with this phenomenon is going to open new doors. Now, I would like to start with a couple of things about these. These are projections, right? We know we're okay up till 2020, which is now 20 right here, but these are guesses. These are extrapolations of what's going to happen. And one has to be a little bit leery of extrapolation. And here we have a famous Danish proverb that said it's difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. So you have to take this graph with a little bit of grain of salt. That's what we think is going to happen, but until it happens, we don't know that it did happen. Okay, I think I've showed you this slide before. This is the cultural, this is just the social gerontology. These numbers in green, and these are countries down here, are the age at which people in that country think old age begins. So in Turkey, people think old age begins at 55. In Greece, people think old age begins at 68. When is youth over? In Turkey, youth is over at 35, and in Greece, youth is over at age 50. So Greek mothers still think their 45 and 50-year-old sons and daughters are young. So let's do a little, why can't I see the quiz here? Why can't I see usually I can see oh, it's up above. Okay, in the chat, I want you to tell me what you think, when you think old age starts in Ethiopia, and when you think youth ends. Can you please put a few answers in the chat, just so I can see some numbers? When does old age start? When does youth end? I don't see anybody in the chat yet. Here we go. 70, that's old age begins at 70, okay. Tell me whether it's older, when does youth end and when does aging begin? Okay. Youth ends at 35, okay. 70 and 35. 25, youth ends at 25. Youth ends at 40. Keep going. Youth ends 60, it starts. Youth, okay, hold on a sec, don't move. Youth ends at 25 and old age starts at 50. So I've been an old man for 25 years already. Okay, that's fine. Okay, enough. That's interesting. That's cute. Thank you. So you can see that even in your own country, there's a heterogeneity of what you people think. So that's a gerontological problem. There's history, the history of aging. And William Faulkner was a great American writer, and he said, the past is never dead. It's not even past, which means that history, we live history today. And the reason that we're having a war right now in Israel, and the reason you have wars in Ethiopia, is in part because of how people view history differently. So the history, old age is also, there are historical elements. This is an important statement by Jonathan Swift, the guy who wrote Gulliver's Travels. Everybody wants to live forever, but nobody wants to grow old. And I think that if you study the sociology of this statement, you'll answer some good questions. A better view, I think, I like George Bernard Shaw, the great Irish playwright, died at age 94, by the way. He wasn't a spring chicken when he died. Do not try to live forever. You will not succeed. I think that's good advice. Okay, so let's look at some random thoughts on gerontology research. That is, what are the questions in aging that relate to medicine and to health? So let's start with the cell, and reminding you something we talked about in the first session, but maybe not everybody was there. Mammalian aging is caused by the gradual failure of an otherwise excellent self-regulating and self-repairing machine. Repair, that is, of proteins and DNA. Because as you will recall, DNA and proteins are damaged by exogenous and endogenous sources. And as you sit through this lecture, your cells are replicating, they're being damaged by ultraviolet light, and right away the soldiers sorry for the use of that language, but the repairmen come in and they repair these faults. But what happens is no repairman, if you give repairmen jobs to do for 50 or 100 years, some repairmen make a mistake, or some repairmen use a tool that doesn't work, or some repairmen replace a fuse with a faulty one. And eventually these uncorrected errors, because most errors are corrected, otherwise you wouldn't be sitting here today. There's an accumulation of uncorrected errors, and that's what causes the phenomenon of old age. It's also related to cancer. The uncorrected errors of damage to DNA also cause cancer. And you can see that cancer and aging are related in that 65% of cancers of those over age 65 in the world with cancer. I'll rephrase it, sorry. What percentage of cancers are to be found in people over age 65? You take 100 cancers, how many people are over age 65? How many people are under 65 with 100 cancers? What can you put in the chat what you think? Percentage of cancers, age controlled, how many are in old people? How many are less than 65 years? Let's look at the chat. Oh, you can't see someone can't see the PowerPoint? Is that common, or you can see the PowerPoint?
We can see it. Yeah, we can see it.
25% of cancers are found in people over age 65. Someone says 65%. Someone says 30%. Keep going. One more guess. I need another guess. Somebody be brave. 79. Okay, so the truth is that 90% of cancers are to be found in people over age 65 in the world, which gives you a kind of hint about why they're connected. There is a concept, what we call geroscience, that says that aging, these diseases that you see with aging are not separate. I'm not saying this is true. I'm telling you that the geroscience concept says the following: these separate diseases are not separate. They're various manifestations of the disease called aging. Remember what I showed you here? This gradual accumulation of uncorrected errors leads to aging, and we also know leads to cancer. People go further. They say that these uncorrected errors cause all of the diseases that we associate with old age, and that meaning that eventually, if you lived long enough, you'd get all these diseases. They also think that we shouldn't be treating these individual diseases. We should be treating the unter disease, aging, the primordial disease. And if we treated aging, we would see far less of this. That's a theory. It's called the geroscience theory. You can read about it if you want in Campesi or other people. And we'll see, by the time you guys are old, we'll see if that's true. I probably won't make it. Remember the comparative old age? This is an interesting thing to study. Humans live to a maximum of 122 years. Monkeys live to a maximum of 50 years. Mice live to a maximum of 4 years. Mice, monkeys, men. Now, I think we've discussed this before, but let's test your memory. In the chat, what percentage of DNA do humans and monkeys and mice have in common? We all have DNA. How much overlap is there? What percentage of overlap is there with a mouse DNA and a man's DNA? Can you put the number in? 70, is that 70 to 80%? Okay, 95%, 20%, keep going. 98%, keep going. 90%, keep going. One more. Okay, you guys remember, I must have discussed this with you. So between mice and men, it's about 97.5%. Many of you got it right. Between monkeys and men, it's about 99.5%. So we have the same, just a second. We have practically the same DNA. Monkeys, mice, and humans have almost the same DNA. We don't have the same DNA as worms, or the same DNA as corn, or the same DNA as a tree, but we have the same DNA. All mammals have very similar DNA. And vive la différence. Look at the difference in phenotype between me and a dog, between me and a monkey, between me and a mouse. But we're almost the same. So this business can't be determined just by the differences in DNA. It has to be determined by differences in the efficiency of this repair mechanism, which differs in mice and monkeys and human beings. And that's a researchable question. So what are the mechanisms of cellular? Here's the first question. What are the mechanisms of cellular aging, and is it possible to intervene to slow these down? And here you have a cell membrane, intracellular, extracellular, and we see a drug, metformin, which is used for diabetes today. But some people think that metformin is the drug you should use, not just for diabetics, but for anybody over age 40 or 50. They claim, they hypothesize that use of metformin, because of its effects on cellular aging, I won't go into the details, but it does have an effect on cellular aging. They think that metformin will mimic the effect of caloric restriction, which we know increases longevity. So there's all kinds of intracellular theories going on, and whichever one of you discovers that in the future, you'll win the Nobel Prize. Okay, let's go from the cell to the organ. What's the oldest organ in the world? Can someone, have we discussed this already? I want on the chat, the oldest organ in the world. What's the oldest organ? Any guesses? I'm looking at the chat. There's no guesses. The oldest organ in the world. Come on, we have 57 young geniuses sitting listening to me. The brain, okay, good. What's the oldest organ in the world? Someone else? The brain, the skin. That's interesting. Okay, skin, brain. What else? One more guess. Lungs. Okay, thank you. Well, actually, the oldest organ in the world is to be found right here. Here's a quiz. Here it is. The oldest organ of the world is the organ in the Basilica of Valère in Sion, Switzerland. That's the oldest organ in the world. So we're just kidding around a little bit. Okay, here's an organ, the kidneys. When the kidneys are young, they're called kidneys. And when the kidneys are older, they're called adult knees. And we know that glomerular filtration, kidney function, goes down normally with age. We know that. My glomerular filtration, even though I don't have any kidney disease, is not the same as it was when I was 30. Because we have so much reserve, these adult knees can cope with the job well into years, well into when I reach 100, 110, 120. People have lived to 122, and they died not of kidney failure. Their kidneys still worked. So, but the kidneys do age at a certain rate. The good news is there's so much reserve in young kidneys that you die well before your kidneys die. If you get kidney disease, that's different. Kidney disease can kill you. And we know this because those you know that when we study lung function tests and we measure people's FEV1 and we measure their functional reserve, etc., we know that we have to control for age. We know that because we know that lungs age at a certain rate, that without lung disease, you don't have to smoke, you don't have to have been exposed to pollution. My lungs, although they're good enough for me, they're not the same. They don't work as efficiently as they did when I was 30. Even though they're so good and I didn't smoke, they're going to last me into my hundreds. But if you lived 150, it's possible that your lungs wouldn't be able to support you. We know that when we measure bone density, we have to control for age. We know that when we measure grip strength, we have to control for age. The brain was mentioned. And we had a whole session last time on the aging brain and dementia and the difference between normal aging, which is me having trouble remembering lyrics of songs, and dementia, which is me never being able to remember the lyrics of songs. There's a difference. It takes me longer to learn a new song, but I can still do it. If I were demented, I wouldn't be able to learn new songs. So remember, to distinguish between aging and disease is not an easy thing. This is respiratory function at age 0 and at age 90. And we see, let's just look at normal. This is the normal curve. So we see that the respiratory function of a newborn is very inefficient. They really don't breathe very well. And if they are infected, if they are sick, if they are stunted, they don't have much reserve there. As a child grows and goes into puberty, they reach a very high level of lung function, say 100%. But slowly, slowly, with normal age, it goes down. But you can see that if you can live with 20% lung function, you can certainly live with 80% lung function. But the difference between aging lung and a diseased lung is an interesting question. We know that all of aging in normal people leads to a loss of reserve, but we have so much reserve in our adult knees, right, in our lungs, in our muscles, that they have to deteriorate quite a bit before we die of normal aging. If you get a disease superimposed on that, if you get COPD or lung cancer or fibrotic lung disease, et cetera, you're going to have, here's a sick person. Here we have someone with below normal early decline caused by smoking and air pollution, so that their lung function goes down, and they can easily die of an infection that wouldn't kill someone with a normal lung function. Okay, so remember, aging I just want to move something here so I can see. Aging organs in the best situation result in a loss of reserve, not in disease. When they have disease, that's a different story. So the difference between aging and disease, where you cross that line, is a good question to study in gerontology and in geriatrics. Now, remember I said that aging at worst, at best, causes a loss of reserve, but at worst, it causes you to go down below where you can survive. And we have this, that's why in the NCD lecture, we talked about the increased prevalence of age-related diseases. Is it caused by age, as the geroscientists think? Is it caused by a fundamental process? Is it caused by separate processes superimposed on aging? In other words, do you get, here's normal aging of the lungs, but if you smoke, you can bring it down so that if you get infection at this age, you won't be able to recover from it. That's why in COVID, so many older people died, because while they had normal lungs, their lungs were not as robust as they were when they were at their height. Okay, so here we have a slide, I forgot. Okay, so this is, you've seen this slide before. This is multivariate adjusted risk of death from COVID at 28 days, pardon me. So these are all it's a little hard for you to see the slide, but this is age, this is sex, this is BMI, this is comorbidity, coronary artery disease, congestive heart failure. All of these comorbidities added to the chance of dying, but nothing was as bad as aging. Here we have 80 plus getting COVID, and 20, your age, 20, 25, 30. My chance, where am I? I'm in my 70s. My chance of dying of COVID, if I got it, and I did get it, I didn't die, my chance of dying it is 600 times more than my grandchildren. Even though I'm not sick, I don't have any illness, I don't have any serious lung or heart illnesses that I know of, or cancer, but my chance is 600 times higher, caused by this mixture of aging and loss of reserve. How do we slow? Research question number 2 for the Nobel Prize winners. How can we slow this loss of organ reserve, not cell, organ? So we know, looking at the heart and the brain, we know that certain things that we do, forget multivitamins, we shouldn't take them, but perhaps diet affects us to keep our reserve higher. Perhaps we know that exercise certainly keeps the reserve of heart and lungs and muscles higher. Certain medications prevent you from getting into trouble, like statins. Research question 2B, right? What is the difference between aging and disease? If you can solve this problem and write an article, you'll get it in the New England Journal, and you might even win the Nobel Prize. In other words, if you can tell me the difference between aging as a process and disease as a separate entity, if you can untangle that, you'll win a prize. Okay, so we've talked about the cell, we've talked about the organ. Let's talk a little bit about population aging, which is a whole other subject. And the demographers are people, gerontologists, that look at how populations age. And this is the classic slide of the demographic transition, which I'm sure you know, which is that early in history, countries have high fertility, high death rate, low population. As the death rate falls and subsequently the birth rate falls, you get population growth and an older age population. Okay? So This is Japan. This is Israel. This is Ethiopia. Your birth rates are falling, but they're still high. Your death rates are falling. They're definitely much lower than they were 20, 30, 40 years ago, but they're still higher than they should be, and the birth rate is still higher than it should be. And as these things change, your population will grow. It's already growing, but it will also age. So here's an example of a country that's gone through its demographic transition and is now here with a population that's stable or falling and low fertility and low mortality. Japan. This is the population pyramid of Japan in 1950. This is the population pyramid of Japan sort of today. And this is the population pyramid of Japan in merely 25 years. Look at all the old people in this population. Look at the number of people over age, that's 70. The area under the curve here is the number of old people over age 70. The area under the curve here is the number of people under age 20. And the area here, 65 to 25, is the working age population. Put the proportion of the working age population over the older population, and you see you've got a problem. In the old days, the working age population went from here to here, and the old age population was there. So now you see that the things are flipping, and it's going to become very difficult for people to find a plumber in Japan a few years from now, because that's a job for young people. Have I showed you this slide before? Ganesh, have we seen this slide before?
I don't think so.
I don't think so. This is my late father, and this is my beautiful daughter. My late father was 85 here, and my daughter was 20. The question is, at age 85, when my daughter reaches 85, will she be healthier than my father was at 85? When I reach 85, 11 years from now, will I be healthier than my dad was at age 85? That's a central question in gerontology. Okay? And the way to look at this question is an article that goes back 43 years now to the New England Journal of Medicine by a fellow named Fries. What he saw was that if you looked at populations at age 0, they were 100% alive. And if you looked at how populations went as they aged, you would see that in 1990, the population decreased like that at a very relatively rapid rate. By 1980, the population was very few people were dying until they were 60. And then there started to be more of a curve, and everybody died by age 100, more or less. He hypothesized that in the next 20 to 30 years, this is what we would see. We'd see what's called a squaring of the curve, a squaring of the demography curve. He hypothesized, so what happened? This was an article in the New England Journal. He said, this is what's going to happen in the next 20, 30, 40 years. What happened? Okay, so there's six strains, 6 lines of evidence that suggest that indeed he was right. If we look at the last 20, 30, 40 years, then in fact, this is indeed what happened. How do we know this? Well, we looked at the demographic transition, which I just showed you. We looked at the rise in life expectancy, which we've dealt with. They looked at the last year of life, and I'm going to say something that may sound a bit crazy to you, but I want you to think carefully about what I'm saying. And that is that in the last year of people's lives today versus 20 years ago, versus 30 years ago, versus 40 years ago, they were less sick in that last year of life today than they were 20, 30, 40 years ago. Obviously, it was the last year of their lives, so they must have had something wrong with them. But they didn't spend all that much time being sick. They were sick for 250 or 300 days of the last year of their life, and then they died. So that suggests that people are healthier because they're living longer, being well until they suddenly get sick and die. The prevalence of Alzheimer's disease, we went over this last session. It's going down, to remind you, for those that weren't there. Although there's more people with Alzheimer's disease in the world, that's because there's more old people. But if you take 100 old people today versus 100 old people 30 years ago, there is fewer of them demented today than 100 80-year-olds were 30 years ago. In wealthy countries, the rates of institutionalization in nursing homes are going down because, again, we think because old people are healthier. And if you measure their disability, even people living in the community, old people today are less disabled. Old people today are less disabled than my father was. She is likely to be less disabled in her 80s and 90s than my father was. I am more likely to be less disabled than my father was in his when I'm 85. My father lived to 100, but I also plan to live to 100, 110. So, that's why you're going to have me around to lecture to you for the next, well, I'm 74 soon. So you've got me around for another 30 or 40 years to bother you. Okay, so all of these strains of evidence suggest that indeed, old people, my daughter is likely in old age to be healthier than my father was. And so you too, the people on this listening to this webinar. Okay? But we do have some dangers going on in wealthy countries. And you see this epidemic of obesity could cause this good news to regress. It could. And that's a research question. Does the rising tide of NCDs and obesity, diabetes, which accompany them, and you see it in your own country, although it's not as common as it is in Israel, and in Israel it's less common than it is in Europe or the United States. But that could turn the tide. And will it turn the tide? Will people in the future be less healthy? My father wasn't obese. He had a little bit of a belly, but he wasn't obese. He did sports. Well, if my daughter, and she's not obese today, she's now 35 and it's just as beautiful, but she's not obese. But I'm talking about large populations. If this generation of people gets obese, they will be less healthy than my father was in his old age. Okay? And I think I showed you this slide last time, but both in the introduction and in the NCDs. But this shows you the number of diabetics in the world in 2000. In Africa, there were 7 million diabetics in 2000. 2030, which is just around the corner, there are going to be 19 million diabetics. Okay? In South India, there were 32 million diabetics in the year 2000. By just a few short years from now, 5 or 6 years from now, there'll be 80 million diabetics. Diabetes is not aging, but it causes accelerating aging. So this diabetes epidemic that we talked about in the NCDs is a big threat to this question: will she be healthier than he was when she's 85? I'm not talking about her, but her cohort, your cohort. Okay? If you're interested in this question, I did a debate with my friend and colleague, Dr. Jay Olshansky. I said healthy life expectancy is expanding, and he said healthy life expectancy is not expanding. And if you're interested in reading that debate, see who's right, look up the Journal of the American Geriatric Society, 2017, look up my name, look up his name. You'll get the slide set, I think, from the group. You can look it up. You can read the debate. You can write me a note and tell me I was right or Olshansky was right or you're both right. Okay. So given what we know, how do we ensure that populations, the cell, the organ, the person, and now populations. So how do we ensure that the population of Ethiopia, now 220 million strong, how do we encourage them to age well? Well, everything I talked about in health squaring is relevant. People need to work longer, not in the fields. Those, the population, the farmers that you have are going to have to go through a bit of a transition, as they have in many other countries, and stop that hard labor in the fields. But once they do, and they get factory jobs or service jobs, they're going to have to work longer. Are people in Ethiopia investing in pensions? Most people in Ethiopia don't have a pension. And if they reach old age and they don't have a family around them, they can suffer from dire poverty, as you know. When people get richer, when people live longer, when people have pensions, how are they going to handle their leisure? What do? I mean, I'm retired now. I'm retired from my salary. But here I am talking to you people for free. Why? Because it makes me feel better. It expands my mind. It keeps me alive. It exposes me to young people, to your questions, to your queries. So it's not enough to have enough money and to retire. Many people who retire in rich countries become bored and depressed because their whole lives they worked, and suddenly they're not working. So you have to think about leisure. We have to build healthy cities. It can't be that as I walked along the streets of Gondar at night, I could have fallen into a hole in the sidewalk. It can't be that in Gondar, there's only one park behind, those of you from Gondar will know, behind the park, behind the hospital, in that lane where people play soccer, play football. There's a nice park with a big tree that my wife and I, when we worked there, used to go for a walk there. That's a big city. You can't have one park. You have to have many parks. There's a big park I see in Addis near the president's house. I don't know if that's open to the public. Are people able to walk in there? Is it safe? I hope so. But you need more than just one park. And then there's this question, as the number of old people rise and the number of young people fall, will there be intergenerational conflict? And I think I told you this in the introductory lecture when I gave a lecture to public health students and professors in Gondar when I was there on sabbatical. One of the in the audience put up his hand. He was very polite, because you Ethiopians are polite people, and you said, "Well, professor, I thank you for your lecture. It was very interesting, blah blah." And I said, "Thank you. You're welcome. I thank you." He said, "But I'm a little worried about what you're saying." I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, we have so much need in Ethiopia among children. How can we invest in old people?" And I said, "That's a good question. And the answer is you have to invest in the healthcare system as a whole and have universal health care, which will look after children, middle-aged people, and older people. And that's the answer, that you have to look after the whole population, be they young, old, middle-aged, or old, and ensure that your old people are healthy longer so that they won't be a burden on themselves, their family, and the healthcare system." Okay, and there's many other aspects to this research question. How do we get research question 3B? How do we ensure that population will age well? These are some of the elements, but it requires careful research to find out what's important: working, pensions, leisure, the environment. How do we deal with younger generation, etc.? It's a very good research question. Okay, how can we look like this at age 75? Because this guy doesn't need any medical help, right? He can look after his grandchildren. He can look after his children. He's not a burden on the state. He doesn't need many healthcare services because he's a healthy guy. Okay, let's talk finally. We've talked about the cell, the organ, the population, now the person, the individual. Okay, can RCTs answer all the clinical questions in subpopulations of sick people? Can they answer? Please put on your chat, is the answer to this yes or no? RCTs answer many questions. Will they answer all the questions we need to know? Do we have all the answers in RCTs? I'd like to see in the chat some answers. Yes, no, maybe, we'll see. No. Okay. Someone says no, no. Anybody else? No. Okay, we have a consensus. No, no, no. You're right. They won't answer all the questions, but they'll answer many of those questions. And we have to do more RCTs which involve old people. But why don't we? Because we don't have enough money. And there's a whole question of efficacy versus effectiveness. Dr. Chiganish, are you familiar with this epidemiological term of efficacy versus effectiveness, or should I explain it?
Kindly explain it, please.
Explain, okay. So when you do an RCT, when you do a randomized controlled trial, and you give people with high cholesterol statins, and you give a placebo to people without with high cholesterol, you see a difference. But clinical trials, randomized clinical trials, are done in very specific groups of people that are highly homogeneous. And oftentimes there are no old people in those studies, and there are no. If you look at high cholesterol, if you look at cholesterol lowering drugs or not, often you exclude people with ischemic heart disease, you exclude people with diabetes, you exclude people with COPD in order to get a clean scientific question, which means that the answer you have is a very pure answer, but it doesn't answer. It shows you that the drug is efficacious in those to whom it is given, but is it effective in a general population? That's the difference. So let's look at the SHEP trial. The SHEP trial was one that back in the day, when I was your age, we didn't know if treating systolic hypertension in elderly people made any difference. We didn't know the answer to that. So we did a huge trial that looked at 4,700 people. They randomized them into two groups, 2,000 who got 4,000 people with systolic hypertension over age 65. 2,300 of them got treatment. 2,300 of them got placebo. And the answer was yes, indeed, it did. In these 4,700 people, it did. If you treated systolic hypertension, you had less death, you had less congestive heart failure, you had less dementia, etc. But the big but is what we saw was this was a very efficacious thing to do. In the 4,000 people in whom it was studied, it seemed to work. But in order to get to these 4,000 people, they identified 500,000 people, and only 32,000 of them met the research criteria, and only 4,700 of them were randomized. So only 1% of the people who had the disease were studied, which means it's very possible that while in the 1% of old people whose systolic hypertension was treated, it worked. But what about the other 99% of the population that we didn't study? Because they were too uneducated, they couldn't speak English, they couldn't speak Amharic, they had diabetes, they were obese, they were demented, etc., etc. So it may help in a very clean population. It may be efficacious, but not effective. So we don't know that. There's lots of clinical trials you can do. And I got together with a bunch of colleagues, and we wrote a paper called Increasing the Participation of the Elderly in Clinical Trials. And we showed that it's very important not to exclude old people from clinical trials, so we get an answer whether a hypertension drug that works in 40-year-olds also works in 84-year-olds. Okay, is that clear? Dr. Scanish, does that help to understand the difference between efficacy? Okay, thank you. And you can look it up. Okay, what about old people and human rights? We'd like to talk about human rights today, humans, aging, and human rights. There is such a thing called ageism, which is like racism, but for old people. We think, oh, he's old, he can't do it. He's old, he can't manage. He's old, he can't decide. He's old, he doesn't deserve the property. And the human rights have evolved very significantly since 1215, when the Magna Carta was pronounced. Now, the Magna Carta was our first human rights document, but really all it said was that the king did not have absolute power over the nobles. The nobles had to be consulted. That's not exactly a ringing endorsement of universal human rights, but after 1948, there was an endorsement of Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but it didn't relate to age. It related to sex, it related to race, it related to religion, it didn't relate to age. So we have a lot of ageism and the effect of ageism on old people around the world, in Ethiopia and in Israel. So in the declaration, it said all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherly love. Well, look what happens in Ethiopia, look what happens in Israel, but leave that out for a second. Just because people are old doesn't mean they've lost their freedom that they were born with. Just because they're old doesn't mean they should be unequal in dignity and rights. And so there's a movement among gerontologists and some geriatricians to define a universal declaration of human rights for older people, because while this is a wonderful document, while this is really and indeed a wonderful document, it doesn't cover all aspects, because when it was written, as you know, in 1948, there weren't very many old people. We didn't think about the problems of old people. But fast forward 80 years, there are a lot of old people in the world we didn't think about before. They need human rights too. So, research question. How can we reconcile what we know about cells, organs, and populations to ensure as much as possible a good life for each and every older person at a cost that society, the young and the old, can bear? And my caveat is, with luck, we're all going to get there. But we want to ensure that there aren't clashes between young and old, like there shouldn't be clashes between men and women, like there shouldn't be clashes between whites and blacks, like there shouldn't be clashes between Arabs and Jews. Now, what are you going to do? I'm asking what you guys are going to do. There's public policy and there's individual behavior. So you guys have to start to think about how we can use the free will that God gave us and make the world a better place for all old people. An interesting question, which I'll end with, or almost end with, is, what do old people want? I've been telling you what's good for old people, but why don't we just ask them what they want? And if you ask them what they want, they'll tell you that what's really important to them, not in necessarily in order of importance, but all of these six, 5 issues are extremely important to old people. They do care about their health. They do care about their family. They do care about helping others, giving back, like me, talking to you guys tonight, this evening. They worry about a good death. Most old people, if you ask them, they're not afraid of dying. What they don't want is a painful, long, lingering death. That's what they don't want. And many of them have questions towards the end of life about religion, spirituality, and what does it mean? Why am I here on earth? What did I do? How can I pass on my wealth and wisdom to my children and grandchildren so that they'll have a better life than I've had? And one way of looking at this is comparing religions. So we wrote a paper, you can look it up if you like, back in 20 years ago, back in the Journal of the American Geriatrics Society, by myself and 4 other colleagues. We looked at ethical issues in end-of-life geriatric care, and we compared Judaism, Catholicism, and Islam, and we showed what they shared and where they differed in views of exactly this business here. What's a good death? How does Judaism view the end of life? How does Catholicism or Ethiopian Coptic Christianity view death and dying? And these are interesting research questions that you can do by asking questions and comparing the answers from Judaism, leave Catholicism, Christianity in its different forms, or Islam in its 2 different forms. What about the resilience of old people? Research question. What can we learn from survivors? So these survivors are the veterans of the First World War, which I was privileged, and I'm old enough now. When I was an intern, we still had some of these old guys who had survived the First World War. They were in their 90s and 100s, and I looked after them, and I felt privileged. Fast forward 30 years, Holocaust survivors, which is, of course, very relevant today because we just had a pogrom in Israel 3 weeks ago against Jews. This guy has a tattoo on his arm showing that he survived the Auschwitz death camp. And how do these people survive? How do they live through this terrible trauma and end up having families, enjoying life, doing sports, reading books, writing books? What is it? What is it about the resilience of older people that can help us to, what can we learn about the resilience of these older people that can help us build resilient societies and be resilient individuals? Now, there's some great things about old age. Have I showed you this painting before or not?
I don't think so.
Okay, so I want to guess. I want you in your chat to tell me what year this painting was painted. Give me what century. You don't need to know the year. Let's look at the Q in the chat. What century is that painting from? '20th, 19th, 16th, 17th, 15th, 14th. Come on, you guys. Those of you who are still awake. 18th century. Keep going. Thank you, Mela. 1900. Keep going. 2 more. 1400. Excellent. It was in the that's the answer. It was in the 15th century. This painting was by Geraldine Dale. Whoops. And whoops. And what does it show? It shows an elderly man, presumably a grandfather, and a young child. And look at the love that they have for each other. Now, he's not the best looking guy on the block, is he? He's got some kind of rhinophyma and some kind of hairy excrescence from his forehead. He's not Clint Eastwood in age 60. And yet this little child knows nothing about ugliness because ugliness is taught. And this is her grandfather, and he loves her and he loves him. And this is the natural advantage of old age, the love that we have for our parents and grandparents and the overwhelming love they have for us. How do we take advantage of that? How do we utilize it? How do we expand it? How do we magnify it? These are research questions. Have I showed you this slide before? Have you seen this slide?
I don't think so.
No. So what this is self-reported well-being. You ask somebody, how are you? Are you in pretty good shape? Are you in very good shape? Pretty good shape? Not so great? Terrible? On my deathbed. Ask people how they are, and you'll see that they will. Self-reported health is an excellent predictor of death and dying. If you say you're in bad shape, you're more likely to die than if you say you're in great shape. And on a scale of 10, 1 to 10, 10 being the highest well-being, we see that 18-year-olds on average have a well-being score of about 7. When you ask them, how are you doing? They say, we're pretty good. The bad news is, and you guys are all in this group, the bad news is self-reported well-being falls with age until it reaches a nadir at age 50. And that's why some people have what's called a midlife crisis. They're 50 years old. They say, what have I done with my life? I wanted to be a professor. I'm not a professor. I want to be a pilot. I'm not a pilot. They get depressed. They kill themselves. But look, if you survive that, look what happens as you enter old age. And here I am. I'm much happier than you are. Here I am. I'm up here and you guys are down here. So we have to try and understand, why is it that although I've passed most of my life, I'm not as good looking, I'm not as strong, my memory's not as good, yet I have a sense of well-being that's higher than younger people? So that's an interesting question. I don't have the answer to it, but it's a researchable question. How can we make this curve look not like this, but like this, or like this? How do we do it? That's a research question. So I think I'm going to end on that note and tell you that, or hope that we looked into aging, the questions that are the gerontological questions that are of clinical interest vis-a-vis the cell, the organ, the population, and finally the person. And before we get on to our quiz, I just wanted, some of you have asked me what the situation in Israel is today. I don't want to go into it in great detail, but I did give a webinar a couple of weeks ago to the Jewish Medical Association, which is like this association of doctors in the UK. And if you want to click on that, you'll find a YouTube which explains my perspective. Doesn't mean it's the right one. It's just my perspective, what I think, what's going on in this terrible war and how we're going to get out of it, how it's affecting health. It's not the subject for today, but I figured I couldn't, you couldn't know where I'm living right now in Jerusalem, close to a bomb shelter, without me talking about this. Okay, so thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Toda rabba, Masaganalu. And I'm very, very happy now to stop sharing, and hand over the podium to your organizers, and you guys can do your quiz now. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. I've sent the Google form on the link. So everyone, please try to do it. And let us have 5 minutes break, I think.
Okay, great. So let's have a look at can you slide it out of it? Right. Compared to 20 years ago, are older people 80 plus, are they healthier than are older people today healthier than the previous cohort 20 years ago? Are they less healthy than the previous cohort? Have the same level of health? Well, in my view, they're healthier. Okay. Oh, you've got the right answer. Okay, good. Okay,
Thank
go
you.
ahead.
We'll proceed with the second question.
Okay. On average, yeah. Okay, which cohort is the least happy, satisfied with life? It's B, isn't it? It's you guys. I'm sorry you're heading in that direction, but try and take some happiness pills. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. We'll proceed with the second.
Okay. So even in normal aging, all organs lose some clinical reserve, and the answer is yes. The question is how much they reserve, and do they tip over into aging, into disease? Okay, and finally.
Okay, the final question is. So we've slightly modified the question, as you can see.
Yeah, when you ask old people, which of the following is not the most important concern of older people? And the right answer is C. They're not worried about dying. They're worried about how they're going to die. So that's correct. C is the correct answer. What's not the least important concern of old people? C. Okay, so you all passed, I imagine.
So thank you. Yes, most of the responses managed to score.
Okay.
More questions. So we have one question.
Okay, what is that?
So can you see it?
Yeah. Israel's current life expectancy. Yeah, I'll read it out. Israel's current life expectancy is around 83 years, which is a good number. Also, Professor looks pretty young for your age. What is the secret behind Okay, so thank you for the compliment. The whole question is why is Israel's life expectancy so high? It's so high because we provide the conditions of life that enable you not to die young. So why is it that in Ethiopia, relatively wealthy people, live much longer than relatively poor people? Because relatively wealthy people can put themselves in conditions where they're exposed as children to proper vaccinations, clean water, they don't get stunting, they get a good education. If they get sick, they see a doctor. If they enter middle age, they check for NCDs, they get vaccinated in old age against flu and COVID, etc. Israel provides the conditions for people not to die young. And when you don't die young, for the most part, you reach a high age. Now, we have a higher life expectancy than Greece or than France, and they also have those. There's some funny things at the end of life that are really interesting research questions, and the answer to them is the answer to your question. So why is Israel have a higher life expectancy? Not than Ethiopia, that we know, but why does Israel have a higher life expectancy than, say, United States or Germany or Poland? These are all wealthy countries. And it probably has to do with family and social solidarity, which is very strong in this country, very strong. In other words, as it is, I know in Ethiopia. I'm not saying we're better than you. We're like you, but we're a modern, wealthy country. We haven't lost. Most countries, as they enter wealth, their traditions and their familial strength seems to dissipate, and it hasn't dissipated in Israel. And I think that's probably our secret. How we get into a healthy old age. Hope I answered. We don't know the answer. The simple answer is we don't know, but I've given you some thoughts as to what might explain it, and that seems to explain the differences between Israel and other wealthy countries.
Thank you very much for your response,
okay,
Professor.
Okay, so you guys, I thought you were an endocrinologist when you came to Gondar. No. I was a geriatrician. My wife was a hematologist. My wife is a hematologist. I am a geriatrician. So I don't know why you thought I was an endocrinologist. Maybe because I was interested in diabetes, but no. Okay, well, not the end of the world to think that.
Thank you for addressing that question, Professor.
Sure, you're welcome.
We have no questions so far.
Okay.
There are no questions in the Q&A and in the chat as well. So
I guess I've answered all your questions in the last 4 sessions.
Yes, I think so. I think it was clear and precise, so everyone has understood it very well.
Okay.
I think that's the case. So
my pleasure.
Think, if we have no questions, we'll wrap up our webinar. So thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you.
On behalf of Yetena team and on behalf of the attendees, I would like to say thank you very much. You've been able to provide us with this lecture in such testing time. So thank you very much. We really appreciate the effort you've put in. Thank you for joining us as well, Dr. Fulso. It's always good to see you. So thank you very much to all the attendees and to all the participants. So we'll share the slide shortly in our Telegram group, and you'll receive your respective certificates within the following few days. So please be patient. So with that, thank you very much, Professor.
Okay, call me back when you want something else. And all the best to you all. And I look forward to visiting you when next I come to Ethiopia.
Thank you. We shall await your arrival.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Ciao, ciao.
Thank you.
Bye. So.
Bye.